I'd always loved camping. The crackle of a fire, the smell of pine, the way the world seemed to shrink down to just me and the wilderness. This time, though, it was different. My boyfriend and I decided to head out to the gorge, just the two of us, leaving behind the usual crowd of friends with their loud laughter and endless beer cans. It felt special, intimate even, as we pulled up in our beat-up sedan, the sun dipping low over the jagged cliffs. I breathed in the crisp air, feeling a flicker of excitement. This was our chance to unplug, to be alone together. But as I stepped out of the car, something shifted. Two guys emerged from the trailhead, rough-looking, unshaven, their eyes lingering on us a little too long. They didn't say a word, just stared, then climbed into an old Volkswagen van and peeled off, tires kicking up dust. My stomach twisted, but I brushed it off. People pass through these trails all the time, right? I glanced at my boyfriend, his easy grin calming me down. "They're just locals," he said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. I nodded, forcing a smile, but as we started the mile-long hike to our spot, every rustle in the bushes made my heart skip. The gorge was familiar. I'd camped here before, knew the twists of the trail like the back of my hand, but tonight it felt different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. I told myself it was just the adrenaline of being alone with him, the thrill of a quieter adventure. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered that something wasn't right. I kept my eyes on the path, ignoring the way the forest seemed to hold its breath around us. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun had vanished, leaving only a faint orange glow on the horizon. I'd always prided myself on picking the perfect campsite, hidden, cozy, with just enough space for a fire. This time, though, I hesitated. Up the hill, I spotted the faint outline of another tent, its canvas sagging like it'd been there too long. I didn't want company, not tonight, so I steered us to a spot lower down, tucked behind a cluster of pines. It wasn't out of earshot, though. Shouts echoed from the trail, sharp and angry, like someone arguing with the wind. My boyfriend shrugged it off, busy hammering stakes into the ground, but I couldn't shake the unease prickling my skin. Who was up there? Then he appeared. Out of nowhere, like the darkness itself spat him out. A tall, wiry man with greasy hair and eyes that glinted under the fading light. "Need firewood?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I almost laughed. Firewood in the middle of a forest? I told him we'd manage, but he smirked, saying the area was picked clean from weeks of campers. Weeks? I asked how long he'd been out here, and he muttered, "Almost a month." "Alone," he said. My mind raced. A month in the gorge? By himself? I forced a polite smile, but my fingers tightened around the little hatchet in my pack. His story didn't add up. I'd heard those shouts. There was someone else out there. When I pressed him, he stumbled over his words, claiming a few guys were camped across the river. His eyes darted, avoiding mine, and that smirk of his. It wasn't friendly. It was knowing, like he was hiding something I'd regret finding out. He offered to show us his camp, and against my better judgment, we followed. It was a mess. Empty bottles, worn-out boots, a tangle of ropes that looked like they'd tied more than just gear. This wasn't the setup of a lone drifter. My boyfriend stayed quiet, but I could feel my pulse quickening. "Been lonely out here," he said, his gaze lingering on me too long. He claimed he'd come from Pennsylvania, hitched a ride to the gorge, and decided to stay, living off snakes, bugs, whatever he could scavenge. My skin crawled. I pictured the woods behind my old job, a hangout for junkies and drifters, and suddenly I saw him there, blending into that chaos. He wasn't just camping. He was hiding. Back at our site, he stuck around, helping us build a fire. The flames cast shadows across his face, and I swear his eyes never left us. I tried to play it cool, thanking him, hinting he should head back up the hill, but he just stood there, staring. Finally, he trudged off, his silhouette disappearing into the trees. I turned to my boyfriend, my voice barely a whisper. "There's no way I'm sleeping with that creep up there." We had nothing. No gun, no knife, not even a loud whistle to scare off trouble. My boyfriend rubbed my shoulders, promising it'd be fine, but I wasn't convinced. The gorge felt like a trap now, its cliffs closing in. Night settled in, thick and heavy. We crawled into our tent, but sleep wouldn't come. Every snap of a twig, every rustle outside our tarp sent my heart racing. It wasn't the wind. I knew it. It was him. circling us, watching us. I lay there, eyes wide, picturing him crouched just beyond the pines, that smirk stretching across his face. My boyfriend heard it too. He squeezed my hand, but his grip was shaky. "It's just an animal," he whispered. I didn't believe him. The sounds were too deliberate, too close. I imagined him out there with others, waiting for us to drift off. What did he want? Our gear? Our money? Or something worse? My mind spun with stories I'd heard. Hitchhikers gone wrong, loners hiding from warrants, preying on anyone dumb enough to cross their path. Then it hit me. We had to leave. "We're getting out of here," I hissed, already stuffing my sleeping bag into my pack. My boyfriend hesitated, but another branch snapped, louder, closer, and he nodded. We moved fast, quiet as we could, but the tarp rustled too much. I told him to leave it. Better to lose it than let that guy know we were bolting. I stood up, pack slung over my shoulder, and his voice cut through the dark. "Leaving so soon?" My blood froze. He was there somewhere, watching us pack up. We didn't answer, just ran, stumbling over roots, branches clawing at my arms. He yelled again, "Come back!" And I swear I heard a low chuckle behind it, like someone else was out there, laughing at our panic. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I kept going. The gorge swallowing us in its shadows until we hit the trailhead and collapsed by the car. We made it out, but we left that brand new tarp behind, a small price to pay for getting away. The next morning, I called the rangers, spilling everything. They promised to check it out, but I never heard back. Maybe they found him, maybe they didn't. I don't care. What I can't shake is the feeling he's still out there, those glinting eyes tracking me through the trees. He wasn't alone. I know it. His lies about the river campers, the mess of gear, that second voice in the wind. It all adds up to something bigger, something darker. He was running from something, hiding in that gorge, and we stumbled right into his world. I don't camp anymore. I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see him, standing on that hill, staring down at me, his smirk promising he'd find me again. The gorge is full of shadows, and some of them don't sleep. They wait, they watch, and I'll never know what he wanted, or how close we came to finding out. I wasn't meant for summer camp. That much I knew the minute my parents dropped me off in Pennsylvania, surrounded by towering pines and kids who already seemed to know each other. It was my first time away from home, and I hated it. I was small, quiet, the kind of kid who'd rather stay inside with my Super Nintendo than run around screaming with strangers. Orientation was a blur of loud voices and forced smiles, and I stood there clutching my backpack, wishing I could disappear. Everyone else paired off fast, laughing and swapping stories, while I hung back, kicking at the dirt. I figured I'd be alone the whole week, just counting the days until I could go home. But then, this other kid, this short, loud one with a baseball cap tilted just right, came up to me. He grinned like we were already friends, and for some reason, I didn't push him away. It felt good, having someone notice me. That first day, I stuck close to him, trailing behind like a shadow. I didn't know it yet, but he'd be the one to drag me into the scariest night of my life. We were on the camp tour when we saw it, a bunkhouse off to the side, different from the others. The wood was weathered gray, splintered in spots, and the front door was nailed shut with boards. One window hung open, glass jagged like broken teeth. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, and that made it stand out. I whispered to my new friend, asking what it was, and he shrugged, eyes lighting up with this wild curiosity. The counselor leading us didn't know much either, just said it was old, unused, and moved us along. But I could tell my friend wasn't letting it go. His grin got wider, and I felt this nervous flutter in my stomach, like I was already in over my head. Later, as we sat on our bunks pulling on socks for the next activity, he leaned over and said we should check it out. I laughed it off at first, thinking he was joking, but his eyes were serious. I wanted to say no. Every part of me screamed to stay put, but I didn't. He was the coolest kid I'd ever met, and I didn't want him to think I was some scaredy cat. So I nodded, my heart already thumping a little too hard. All week, that bunkhouse stuck in my head. I'd catch myself staring at it during meals or games, wondering what was inside. Was it just dusty beds and cobwebs or something creepier? My friend kept bringing it up too, tossing out ideas like it was some big adventure. Maybe it was haunted. Or maybe kids had snuck in there before and left stuff behind. By the last night, he'd made up his mind. We were going in. He whispered the plan while everyone else was brushing their teeth. Wait until the counselor's lights went out, then sneak over. I felt sick just hearing it. My hands got clammy, and my chest tightened like I couldn't breathe right. I wasn't brave like him. I wasn't built for this. But when he looked at me, waiting for an answer, I couldn't back out. I wanted to be someone he'd remember, not the quiet kid who chickened out. We lay in our bunks, pretending to sleep, watching the clock. My stomach twisted into knots, but there was this tiny spark of excitement too. Like maybe this was what camp was supposed to feel like. When the counselor's cabin went dark, we moved. Slipping out of bed, I pulled on my sneakers, my fingers fumbling with the laces. We crept outside, sticking close to the bunks, the cold night air biting at my skin. The camp was dead quiet. No crickets, no owls, just our breathing and the crunch of gravel underfoot. My friend led the way, his shadow darting ahead as we ran toward the abandoned bunk. My legs felt shaky, like they might give out, but I kept going, driven by this mix of fear and dumb kid pride. The busted window loomed ahead, a black hole in the wall. He climbed through first, quick and fearless, then waved me in. I hesitated, peering into the dark, my mind screaming at me to turn back. But I didn't. I hoisted myself up, glass crunching under my palms, and dropped inside. The air in there was thick, cold, like stepping into a freezer. I couldn't see much, just vague shapes of beds and walls, but it felt wrong, like the place didn't want us there. I stuck my arms out, fumbling through the dark, and bumped into a bunk. My friend laughed somewhere ahead, but it sounded off, nervous. We shuffled deeper in, bumping into stuff, beds, maybe a table, our sneakers squeaking on the floor. Then I heard it, a bounce, soft at first, like someone shifting on a mattress. I stopped, holding my breath, thinking it was my friend messing around. "Cut it out," I hissed, but his voice came back from across the room, sharp and confused. "That's not me." My skin went cold. The bouncing got louder, creak, 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 steady, like someone was sitting there, rocking back and forth. I couldn't see anything, no light to show me what it was, just that sound cutting through the dark. My mind spun. Was it another kid? A counselor? Something else? My friend whispered my name, his voice trembling now, and I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Then the bouncing stopped. A loud thud hit the floor, like whatever it was had jumped down. Panic clawed at my throat. I grabbed my friend's arm and we bolted for the window, tripping over beds, my heart hammering so hard I thought it'd burst. We weren't alone in there. I knew it. I felt it. We reached the window, a tiny square of moonlight in the blackness. My friend scrambled through first, his legs kicking as he pulled himself out. I was right behind, climbing up, my hands slipping on the frame. That's when it happened. Two hands, icy and strong, latched onto my ankle. They yanked hard, pulling me back into the dark. I screamed, a raw, choking sound, kicking wildly as my body slid backward. My fingers dug into the wood, splintering under my nails, but I wouldn't let go. Whatever it wasn't human. Not the way it felt, not the way it gripped me like it wanted to drag me down forever. My friend grabbed my arms from outside, yelling, tugging me free. I tumbled out, hitting the ground hard, and we ran like our lives depended on it, back to our bunk, slamming the door shut behind us. We didn't sleep that night. Curled up in our beds, we stared at the door, waiting for something to follow us. I kept feeling those hands, cold, relentless, on my skin, like they'd never let go. We didn't tell the counselors, didn't want the trouble, but when morning came and we left that camp behind, I wasn't the same. I'd wanted to be brave, to be someone, but all I found in that bunk was fear. Fear that still creeps into my dreams, whispering that it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. You have experienced a different life, a phenomenon that you cannot explain. Why? If so, share your story in the comments section below, because someone out there has also experienced the same thing. Don't be afraid to like the video, subscribe to the channel, because the next story could be even more interesting. Share your story. Every October, when the leaves turned gold and red, my family packed up and drove north to a sprawling piece of land owned by my uncle. It was our tradition, a weekend escape from the humdrum of suburban life to a 4-acre patch of wilderness in Upper Michigan. The old wooden house there could hold us all. 5 bedrooms, 3 baths, creaky floors that smelled of pine and dust. My parents and aunts and uncles took the upstairs while us kids crammed into 2 rooms downstairs, giggling over dumb jokes late into the night. I was the oldest, 13 that year, and I liked being the one in charge of my younger cousins and siblings. It made me feel important, like I had a purpose. The land stretched out behind the house into a thick forest, marked by trees splashed with red paint, my uncle's way of saying, "This is ours." Beyond that, miles of county woods, wild and untouched. Back then, I thought of it as our playground. The adults would sit around drinking beer and swapping stories while we'd run wild, chasing each other through the trees. That forest felt alive, welcoming even, with its rustling leaves and hidden trails. But looking back now, I wonder if I missed something, some sign that it wasn't as safe as we thought. Maybe it was the way the wind sounded at night, sharp and restless, or how the shadows seemed to shift when no one was looking. At the time, though, I didn't care. I was a kid, invincible in my own mind, and nothing could touch us out there, or so I believed. It started over lunch that Saturday. The grown-ups were at the picnic table outside, the men nursing beers and swapping hunting tales. My uncle, a big guy with a beard like a lumberjack, was going on about tracking deer in Montana, while my dad nodded along, half listening. Us boys, me and 3 younger cousins, sat at the edge, picking at our sandwiches, when one of them whispered, "What if we camped out tonight?" My eyes lit up. I'd seen my uncle's gear in the shed, tents, lanterns, the works, and the idea hit me like a spark. "Yeah," I said, leaning in, "just us, out in the woods. No girls allowed." We grinned at each other, already imagining the adventure. I pitched it to Dad and my uncle, expecting a fight, but they just laughed, their voices thick with alcohol. "Sure, why not? Toughen you boys up," Dad said, clapping me on the shoulder. My uncle winked, like it was some rite of passage. The moms weren't so thrilled. I caught my aunt muttering to my mom, "They're too young for that forest." Her brow creased with worry. Mom nodded, her lips tight, but she didn't say no outright, just gave me that look, the one that said she trusted me to be smart. I brushed it off. I was 13, practically a man in my own head, and I wasn't about to let their nerves ruin our fun. Still, as we started planning, a tiny knot formed in my gut, like maybe they saw something I didn't. After lunch, Dad and my uncle grabbed a tent from the shed and led us into the woods. We crossed the red-painted trees, the boundary line, and kept going until we hit a small clearing, maybe a quarter-mile in. The ground was soft with moss, green and springy, what my uncle called deer beds. "Perfect spot," he slurred, dropping the tent bag. They were both a little drunk, stumbling over roots and laughing as they showed us how to pitch it. I hammered stakes into the dirt, feeling grown up, while the younger boys fumbled with the poles. The tent was huge, big enough for all 4 of us, and once it was up, we tossed our sleeping bags inside, grinning like we'd built a fortress. We hiked back to the house for the afternoon, playing tag and eating dinner, hot dogs and baked beans, while the moms hovered, still uneasy. "You're too far out there," my aunt said, but Dad waved her off. "They'll be fine. We'll hear them if they scream," he joked, smirking. I laughed too, but it didn't feel funny. Not really. When dusk fell, we grabbed our flashlights and extra blankets. October nights get cold up north, and trudged back to the clearing. The forest was different now, silent. The house's lights faded behind us, swallowed by the trees, and I realized how alone we were. I told myself it was fine. We'd done stuff like this before. But my chest felt tight, like the air was pressing in. Inside the tent, we spread out our sleeping bags and set up a ring of flashlights, their beams bouncing off the canvas walls. I'd brought a deck of Uno cards, and we played round after round, laughing as I won every game. The little ones teased me, "You're cheating," and I grinned, soaking it up. For a while, it was perfect. The forest outside was quiet, just a faint rustle of leaves now and then, and I started to relax. Maybe this was what I needed, to feel in control again, to lead my little crew through the night. Then it happened. A scream cut through the air, sharp and high-pitched, like a girl in trouble. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, faint but clear. We froze, cards slipping from our hands. The youngest one's eyes went wide, his lip trembling. "What was that?" he whispered. I swallowed hard, my heart thudding. "Probably a fox," I said, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "They sound like people sometimes." I'd heard that somewhere, maybe on TV, and it sounded good enough. The others nodded, relieved, and we picked up the game. But I couldn't shake it. That scream didn't feel right, too human, too raw. I kept playing, pretending everything was fine, but my hands shook as I dealt the cards. We'd barely started the next round when the second scream came. Louder, closer, unmistakable. It wasn't a fox. It was a voice, a girl's voice, full of panic or pain or something worse. The tent went dead silent. The youngest one whimpered, curling into his sleeping bag, while the others stared at me, waiting for me to fix it. I didn't know what to do. My mouth went dry, my pulse racing so fast I could hear it in my ears. "Turn off the lights," I hissed, fumbling for my flashlight. We clicked them off one by one, plunging the tent into darkness. I crawled to my spot, pulling the sleeping bag over my legs, and we sat there, barely breathing. I wanted to run. Back to the house, back to Mom and Dad, but the thought of stepping outside stopped me cold. What if something was waiting? What if running made it chase us? My mind spun with stories I'd heard. Lost hikers, wild animals, crazy people hiding in the woods. I was supposed to protect them, but I felt small, helpless, like the kid I still was. "It's okay," I whispered, more to myself than them. Maybe it's nothing. But I didn't believe it. The forest wasn't ours anymore. It belonged to whatever was out there, and we were intruders. We sat in the dark, whispering guesses. Was it a fox? A prank? When the sound came. Footsteps, fast and heavy, crunching through the leaves straight toward us. My stomach dropped. They stopped just outside the tent, close enough that I could have reached out and touched whatever it was. Then the scream hit, ear-splitting, gut-wrenching, right there. The tent shook, fabric flapping like someone was slamming into it. We all screamed, high, wild yells of pure terror. I lunged for the zipper, hands shaking so bad I nearly broke it, and yanked the door open. "Go, go!" I shouted, shoving the others out. We ran, flashlights swinging, beams cutting through the black. One dropped, rolling into the leaves, but I didn't stop to grab it. My legs burned, my breath ragged, every step a prayer we'd make it. I kept seeing it in my head, something behind us, long arms reaching, teeth bared. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The little ones sobbed as they ran, and I yelled at them to keep going, my voice cracking with fear and fury. The house loomed ahead, lights blazing, and we burst into the clearing, screaming bloody murder. The family spilled outside, Mom, Dad, everyone. Faces pale, eyes wide. We'd made it, but I didn't feel safe. Not even close. We collapsed on the grass, gasping, while the adults swarmed us. "What happened?" Mom demanded, grabbing my shoulders. I stammered it out. The screams, the shaking tent, the run. Dad and my uncle grabbed rifles and stormed back into the woods, flashlights bobbing like fireflies. I sat there, shivering, watching them go, half hoping they'd find something, half praying they wouldn't. The younger ones clung to their moms, still crying, and I felt a stab of guilt. I'd led them out there. Promised it'd be fun. My first thought was the girls, our sisters and cousins, playing a trick. But when Dad called them outside, sleepy and confused, I knew it wasn't them. The men came back an hour later, grim-faced. "Nothing," my uncle said. "No tracks, no sign of anyone." The next morning, we hauled the tent back, abandoned in the clearing, and no one spoke much. That was it for camping, for playing outside after dark, for feeling like the woods were ours. I've replayed that night 1,000 times, wondering who or what was out there. A lost hiker? A lunatic? Something else? I'll never know. But I still hear that scream sometimes in my dreams, and I wake up wondering if it's still waiting, out there in the trees, patient, watching for the next kid dumb enough to cross the line. I still remember my first day at Westview High like it was yesterday. I'd just moved to this quiet little suburb in Oregon, starting my junior year in a sea of strangers. The hallways buzzed with laughter and chatter, kids who'd known each other since grade school, their friend groups locked tight. Me? I was the new guy, the outsider, trying to figure out where I fit in, or if I even did. Lunchtime hit me the hardest. Back at my old school, juniors could grab food off campus, but here, we were stuck in the cafeteria. I stood there with my tray, mashed potatoes already going cold, scanning the room for a lifeline. Every table was packed, cliques sprawled out like they owned the place. I felt my stomach twist as I walked past rows of unfamiliar faces. No one looked up. No one waved me over. I didn't want to be that kid, the one who forces himself into a group and gets those awkward pity smiles. Then I saw it, a table tucked in the far corner, away from the chaos. Just two guys sitting there, plenty of empty seats around them. They were identical twins, tan skin and dark eyes that seemed to catch the light a little too sharply. I hesitated, gripping my tray tighter, then made my way over. "Hey, mind if I sit here?" I asked, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. They glanced at each other, a quick, silent exchange, before one of them nodded. I slid into the seat across from them, trying not to look as relieved as I felt. Up close, they didn't seem so bad. They introduced themselves, Ethan and Caleb Torres. No accents, just plain Oregon voices, though something about them hinted at a heritage I couldn't place. They asked me stuff like where I was from, how I liked Westview so far. Normal small talk, but it felt good to have someone actually notice me. Before I knew it, they were inviting me to hang out after school. "You should come with us later," Caleb said, leaning back in his chair. Ethan smirked a little, adding, "Gotta start somewhere, right?" I shrugged and said sure. Why not? I needed friends, and they seemed decent enough. After school, I walked home alone, the weight of my backpack digging into my shoulders. The whole day replayed in my head, those crowded hallways, the cafeteria, Ethan and Caleb's table like some kind of oasis. I dropped my stuff in my room, sprawled out on the bed, and stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd actually made a couple of friends. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, snapping me out of it. It was Ethan, texting me. "Hey, me and Caleb are hanging out tonight. Meet us at St. Mary's Cemetery around 9. There's a cool spot by a creek nearby." I sat up, rereading it. A cemetery? Weird choice, but it was a Friday, and I had nothing going on tomorrow. Plus, they'd been cool to me earlier. I typed back, "Sounds good. See you there." By 8:45, the sky was pitch black outside my window. I pulled on a hoodie, grabbed my phone, and slipped out the front door. Mom was in the living room watching TV, didn't even notice me leave. The air hit me cold, crisp, the kind of night where you can see your breath fog up under the streetlights. St. Mary's was maybe 15 minutes away on foot, down a quiet road lined with old oak trees. I shoved my hands in my pockets and started walking, the glow of my phone screen lighting up my face as I double-checked Ethan's message. "A cool spot by a creek," he'd said. I pictured us kicking back, maybe swapping stories, normal stuff. But the closer I got, the more this little itch started in the back of my mind. Who hangs out in a cemetery at night? The streetlights thinned out as I reached the edge of town, and there it was, St. Mary's Cemetery, all shadows and silence. Rows of headstones poked up from the ground, pale and jagged under the moonlight. I stopped at the rusted iron gate, staring through the bars. It wasn't locked, just sitting there like it was waiting for me to push it open. My heart gave a quick thud, louder than I expected. I shook it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. Ethan and Caleb weren't creeps. They'd been chill at lunch. Still, standing there, I couldn't shake this feeling, like the air was heavier somehow. I pulled out my phone again, texted Ethan. "Almost there. Where you guys at?" My thumb hovered over the send button for a second before I hit it. My phone buzzed almost instantly after I sent the text. Ethan's reply lit up the screen. "We're in the woods past the cemetery, near the creek. Follow this." A pin dropped with the message, a little red dot glowing on the map. I squinted at it, then at the dark tree line beyond the headstones. The woods? That itch in my head turned into a full-on prickle down my neck. I pushed the gate open anyway, the cold metal biting into my palms, and stepped inside. The cemetery stretched out quiet and still, just me and those old graves staring back. I flicked on my phone's flashlight, the weak beam cutting through the dark as I headed toward the back where the trees started. The woods swallowed me up fast. Branches snagged at my hoodie, and the ground turned uneven, all roots and mud. The air smelled damp, like earth and rotting leaves, and I could hear the creak now, a low, gurgling sound somewhere ahead. I held my phone out, the light bouncing off gnarled trunks, and called out, "Ethan? Caleb? You guys here?" My voice sounded small, like the trees sucked it right up. No answer. I checked the map again. Close, maybe 50 feet away. I kept going, pushing past low-hanging limbs, telling myself they were just waiting, maybe setting up some dumb surprise. But then I heard it, a snap, sharp and deliberate, like a twig breaking under weight. I froze, swinging the light around. Nothing. "Come on, don't mess with me," I muttered, half laughing to shake off the nerves. The snaps didn't stop. They came again, slow, steady, crack, crack, like someone was pacing out there, just beyond the light. My chest tightened, and I raised my voice, sharper this time. "Ethan! Caleb! This better not be a joke!" Still nothing, just those steps, closer now, heavy enough to sink into the dirt. I turned in a slow circle, the flashlight shaking in my hand, catching glints of wet leaves and shadows that seemed to twist. My breath hitched. I swore I saw something move, a flicker between the trees. "Guys?" I called again, but it came out weaker, more plea than demand. The steps stopped for a second, and the silence hit harder than the sound. Then they started again, louder, deliberate, right behind me. I didn't have time to think. The steps behind me exploded into a rush, fast, pounding, like something big tearing through the underbrush. I spun around, flashlight slashing wild arcs through the dark, but before I could even scream, a hand clamped onto my neck. Cold, sharp nails dug into my skin, squeezing so tight I choked on my own breath. My phone slipped, the light spinning as it hit the ground, and I heard a voice, Ethan's voice, snarling right in my ear. "Grab him! Grab him now!" Another set of hands yanked at my arm, twisting it back, and I knew Caleb was there too. My knees buckled, but I thrashed hard, swinging blind fists into the dark. Adrenaline took over. I drove my elbow back, felt it connect with something solid, maybe a chest, maybe a jaw, and the grip on my neck loosened just enough. I ripped free, stumbling over roots, and bolted. My lungs burned as I sprinted toward the cemetery, the beam of my phone left behind me like a fading lifeline. Branches whipped my face, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Their footsteps crashed after me, loud and furious, snapping twigs and splashing through mud. "Get back here!" one of them yelled. Caleb, I think, his voice raw and unhinged. I hit the edge of the woods, bursting past the last row of headstones, and didn't slow down until I saw the road's dim glow ahead. They stopped at the tree line. I could feel it, but I kept running, all the way home, my heart slamming against my ribs. I burst through my front door, slamming it shut and locking it with shaking hands. My parents were upstairs, asleep, oblivious. I collapsed against the wall, gulping air, my neck stinging where their nails had torn into me. I stumbled to the bathroom, flipped on the light, and checked the mirror. Red, angry marks raked across my skin, already bruising. Morning came slow, but when it did, I showed my parents everything. They were pissed, scared, ready to call the cops, but I stopped them. "School first," I said, pulling up Ethan's texts on my phone. We took pictures of my neck, went straight to the principal, and laid it all out. With the messages and those marks, Ethan and Caleb were gone, expelled by noon. I blocked their numbers, deleted every trace, and tried to pretend it was over. For a week, I thought I'd dodged the worst of it. Ethan and Caleb were out of my life, erased from Westview High like they'd never existed. I kept my head down at school, avoided the cafeteria corner where we'd met, and told myself I was safe. But sleep didn't come easy. Every creak in the house, every shadow on the wall, had me bolting upright, heart racing. Then, one night, it hit me harder than ever. I woke up shivering, my room ice cold, like someone had left a window open in the dead of winter. I pulled the blanket tighter, blinking into the dark, and that's when I saw it. My window, wide open, curtains flapping like ghosts in the wind. I threw the covers off, my bare feet hitting the chilly floor, and stumbled over to the window. It'd been locked. I checked it every night since the woods, a habit I couldn't shake. My hands shook as I grabbed the frame, peering out into the yard. The moonlight barely touched the grass, but down by the fence I saw something. A shape, tall and still, head tilted like it was staring right back at me. My stomach dropped. "Mom, Dad," I yelled, voice cracking, and slammed the window shut so hard the glass rattled. I spun around, ran to their room, and pounded on the door. Mom stumbled out, half asleep, muttering, "Jake, what's wrong?" I pointed down the hall. Someone opened my window. It wasn't me. Dad groaned, rolling out of bed, and followed me back, grumbling about nightmares. But when we got there, the yard was empty. Dad checked the locks, the yard, everything, while Mom hovered, asking if I was sure I hadn't dreamed it. I showed them the window latch, still intact, no sign of a break-in, but I knew what I'd seen. "It's them," I whispered, my throat tight. "Ethan and Caleb. They're back." Dad called the cops anyway, and I sat there, knees pulled up, telling them the whole story again, the woods, the attack, the expulsion. The officers listened, took notes, but without proof, they just shrugged. "Lock your doors, maybe get a camera," one said before they left. That was it. No answers, no safety. I stopped sleeping after that, always listening for those footsteps, always checking the window. Every night, I'd stare at that latch, waiting, wondering if they'd try again, and what they'd do if they got in. It was 2009, my junior year of high school, and I was coasting through another dull day in English class. The room smelled like old books and pencil shavings, the kind of stale air you get used to after a while. We were nearing the end of the year, working on final projects, some nonsense about analyzing poetry or whatever. The teacher said we needed the school laptops, but the library was shut down all week. Renovations, water damage, something like that. I didn't care enough to remember. Still, she asked who'd go grab the laptop cart. I raised my hand quick. Not because I wanted to help, but because I'd been holding it in for the last 20 minutes and needed an excuse to hit the bathroom. I figured it'd be a quick trip. Stretch my legs, take a leak, grab the cart, and get back before anyone noticed I was gone too long. Simple. That's how it always was around here. I slipped out of the classroom, the door clicking shut behind me, and started down the hall. It was one of those long, empty stretches you only get late in the day, lockers lined up like silent soldiers, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I ducked into the bathroom first, the cold tiles echoing every step. After that, I headed for the library. I'd done this kind of errand before. The carts were always stashed in the back room, behind a glass window. Easy enough. But when I got there, the place was dead. No lights, no people. Just a big, dark box of a building squatting at the end of the hall. The windows let in a little gray light, enough to see the outlines of shelves and tables, but it felt off. Too quiet, maybe. I told myself it was nothing. Just an empty room. Still, my stomach did this little flip, like when you miss a step going downstairs. I ignored it and kept going. I reached the back room door and gave the handle a twist. Locked. Figures. I stood there, staring through the glass into the pitch black beyond, feeling dumber by the second. No cart, no plan, and I wasn't about to march back to class empty-handed, looking like an idiot. I glanced around the library, hoping maybe some janitor or librarian was hiding out somewhere. That's when I heard it. A faint, steady clicking, like someone tapping a pen on a desk. It was coming from the far corner where the study rooms were. My chest tightened a bit, but I brushed it off. Probably just pipes or something settling, right? I started walking toward it, each step louder than I wanted, my sneakers squeaking on the floor. The closer I got, the more I felt it, this itch in the back of my mind, whispering that I shouldn't be here. But I was already in too deep to turn back. The clicking led me to one of the study rooms, its door cracked open just enough to tease the darkness inside. I peeked through the window first, squinting into the gloom. There was something there, tall, still, humanoid, standing in the back corner. My breath caught, but I told myself it was a coat rack or a shadow playing tricks. I pushed the door wider, called out, "Hey, anyone in here?" My voice bounced off the walls, too loud, too shaky. No answer. I flicked the light switch, nothing. Power was off, just like I'd figured. I stepped inside, my heart thudding now, needing to know if I was imagining things. The shape didn't move, but the closer I got, the less it looked normal. Its head was huge, way too big, and it towered over me, 7, maybe 8 feet tall. I froze, my brain screaming at me to run while my legs locked up. Then I saw its face, or what should have been a face, pale and wrong, staring right at me. My gut twisted hard, and when something shifted in the corner, I bolted. I ran like hell, legs pumping, lungs burning, out of the room, through the library, and into the hall. My sneakers slammed the floor, my pulse roaring in my ears. I didn't stop until I saw a teacher, one I knew from last year, walking by. I grabbed her arm, panting, begging her to come back with me, to see it. She snapped at me, asking why I was even in there when the library was off limits. I stammered out my excuse about the laptops, but she cut me off, said they'd been moved to another room. Didn't I hear? I dragged her back anyway, half crazy, needing proof. When we got there, the study room was empty. The lights worked now, buzzing bright, and there was nothing. No shape, no clicking, just bare walls and a desk. She glared at me, annoyed, probably thinking I was high or something. I slunk back to class with the cart from the right room, muttering some excuse to my teacher. I didn't tell anyone else. They'd laugh, call me nuts. But I know what I saw. It wasn't human. It wasn't a trick. And I've never shaken the feeling that it saw me too. You have experienced a different life, a phenomenon that you cannot explain. Why? If so, share your story in the comments section below, because someone out there has also experienced the same thing. Don't be afraid to like the video, subscribe to the channel, because the next story could be even more interesting. Share your story.